Have you ever stopped to wonder how a man of such immense strength, the one who brought down entire armies with his bare hands, could ultimately fall at the hands of a woman? Samson, known as the strongest man in the Bible, faced his greatest defeat not on the battlefield, but in the quiet, deceptive whispers of Delilah. But what really happened? What was it that led this woman to betray the very man who had been the pillar of Israel's power? Was it sheer greed, the pull of temptation, or something even darker, something we may never fully understand? This story is more than just a tale of physical strength. It is a profound reflection on vulnerability, trust, and the consequences of our choices. As we dive deeper into this betrayal, we'll unravel the layers of Delilah's motives and explore why she chose to bring down the man who seemed invincible. Was it a strategic move, driven by external pressures? Or was it something deeply personal, a calculated decision that would ultimately cost Samson everything? Imagine having all the power in the world and still being undone by a whisper in the dark. How did the hero of Israel, whose name still echoes in the halls of history, fall from grace in such a tragic way? This isn't just a story of love and betrayal. It's a warning to all of us about the hidden dangers we sometimes fail to see, even when we think we're invulnerable. Are you ready to peel back the layers and discover the truth behind this heart-wrenching betrayal? Stick with me until the end, and you will uncover the shocking details of what really happened between Samson and Delilah. If you're curious to learn more and feel the power of this story, comment 707 below to let me know you're in for the ride. Let's get started. The shocking truth about Delilah's betrayal of Samson. Samson's story begins long before his birth, during a time of profound suffering and fervent prayer. His parents, Manoah and his wife, whose name remains unknown in the scriptures, carried the heavy sorrow of infertility. In those days, childlessness was seen not only as a personal tragedy, but also as a curse, and there was no greater longing for a couple than to have a child. Manoah and his wife poured out their hearts in prayer, their pleas seemingly unheard, until one day, something extraordinary happened. The angel of the Lord appeared to Manoah's wife while she was alone, bringing a message of hope and divine intervention. She, who had long been barren, was told that she would conceive a child, despite her inability to bear children. This child, however, was no ordinary son. He was to be a Nazirite, consecrated to God from the very moment of conception until the day of his death. He was not merely a gift to his parents, but a divine promise to the people of Israel. Samson was chosen to be the deliverer of his people, a man destined to free them from the oppression of the Philistines, who controlled much of the land of Israel at that time. This announcement was more than just a joyous prophecy. It was a supernatural act that set in motion a much larger plan, one that would reshape the future of the nation. From the moment of his birth, Samson was set apart. His mother received specific instructions on how to raise him. She was to avoid wine and anything unclean, for her child was to be holy unto God. But perhaps the most significant command was that Samson's hair was never to be cut, as it was the key to his divine strength. The Nazirite vow he embodied was a symbol of his separation for God, a reflection of his role as a man chosen to serve a divine purpose. The very strands of hair growing on his head represented a sacred connection between Samson and God. As long as he adhered to this vow, God's strength would remain with him, granting him power beyond that of any ordinary man. As Samson grew, he was keenly aware of the unique nature of his existence. Unlike his friends, who played without care, he understood that his life was not his own. He was not merely a child, he was a living symbol of God's promise to Israel. His strength was not a result of his own efforts, but a divine gift, a power that had a purpose far greater than personal gain. He was chosen not only to be strong, but to lead and deliver his people. However, such a great calling did not come without its challenges. Samson soon discovered that, despite his extraordinary gifts, he was not immune to the temptations of human nature. His physical strength was unmatched, but his heart was still susceptible to the same weaknesses and desires that all humans face. Samson's journey was destined to be a mix of triumph and failure. While he was gifted with immense power, his path would not be free of mistakes. At times, he would be seduced by his own desires, losing sight of his divine purpose. The story of Samson serves as a reminder that even those chosen by God, even the mightiest of individuals, are not beyond the pull of temptation. It's a story of strength, yes, but also of vulnerability. A tale of a man who was called to lead, but struggled with the very nature that made him human. How would he rise from his failures? Could his relationship with God withstand the mistakes he would make along the way? And now we must ask, what is the lesson to be learned from Samson's life? What happens when someone, chosen by God for greatness, is faced with their own flaws? Will Samson's strength be enough to overcome his weaknesses, or will his failures lead to his downfall? Only time will tell. But one thing is clear: his story is far from over. The first indication of Samson's inner turmoil surfaced in his choice of a Philistine wife, which deeply troubled his parents. They knew that such a union was against God's plan for him, and yet Samson was resolute. This decision highlighted the ongoing battle between his divine calling and his personal desires. Though he understood that the Philistine woman was not part of the divine plan for his life, he was irresistibly drawn to her. His parents' reluctance was palpable, but Samson was determined. He claimed that this marriage was part of God's greater plan, a means for him to begin his fight against the Philistines. His declaration revealed a crucial aspect of his character. Although he was deeply focused on his mission, he was often impulsive, making choices driven by his desires that would, in time, lead him down a path of regret. Despite this impulsive nature, Samson's journey was marked by heroic deeds and victories. His strength was unparalleled, and he brought great triumphs to Israel. But what truly set him apart was not just his physical power. It was the presence of God in his life that made his strength supernatural. One of his most iconic feats occurred when he killed a lion with his bare hands, a feat no ordinary man could accomplish. But it was his divine strength that made such impossible tasks possible. And that wasn't the end of his legendary exploits. In another unforgettable battle, Samson found himself facing 1,000 Philistines, all armed and ready for a fight. They believed their numbers would overwhelm him, but what they didn't understand was that Samson wasn't fighting alone. His strength was fueled by something far greater than his own might. Surrounded by his enemies on a barren plain, Samson picked up the discarded jawbone of a donkey, an unlikely weapon. Yet in his hands, this humble bone became an instrument of destruction. The jawbone, though it seemed like a simple tool, was transformed into a lethal weapon through Samson's divine empowerment. Wielding it like a club, Samson struck down the Philistines one after another, not just defeating them, but crushing them with a ferocity that seemed unstoppable. It was as if every blow he struck came not only from his strength, but from a force beyond the physical realm, one that was driven by God's power. But as Samson's victories mounted, the The Philistines began to realize that he was more than just a legendary figure. They recognized him as a real threat to their dominance. They understood that it was only a matter of time before they took more drastic steps to neutralize him. The tension was building, and it was in this moment of rising conflict that Delilah entered Samson's life, turning his already complicated journey into something far more tragic. By the time Delilah appeared, Samson had already established himself as a hero, a man of unmatched strength and extraordinary feats. He had become a legendary figure, revered by his people for his victories. But despite all his triumphs and the divine power that flowed through him, Samson was still human. He was susceptible to the same weaknesses and temptations that any man could face. And it was in this vulnerability, this moment of humanity, that Delilah entered his life, setting in motion the events that would lead to his eventual downfall. Samson's story is one of triumph and failure, of divine strength and human weakness. It raises a powerful question. How can someone so mighty, so chosen by God, still fall prey to the temptations that come with being human? Could Samson's strength have been enough to carry him through? Or was his vulnerability to temptation always a part of God's plan for him? As we reflect on his journey, we are left to wonder, what will happen when someone with such divine potential faces the ultimate test of character? Delilah was no ordinary woman, and her beauty was not the only thing that set her apart. Beneath her breathtaking exterior, she had a clear and singular objective. Whether driven by her own ambitions or manipulated by external forces, Delilah had been chosen to play a crucial role that would alter Samson's destiny. Living in the valley of Sorek, a region strategically situated between Israel and Philistine territories, Delilah found herself in close proximity to the very heart of Israel's enemy. Her life was intricately tied to the Philistines, and she understood the stakes all too well. If she succeeded in bringing down Samson, Israel's mightiest warrior, she would not only gain untold wealth and material rewards, but would also secure herself power and influence. The Philistine leaders were desperate. They knew that the only way to defeat Samson and neutralize his incredible strength was to uncover the secret behind it. Samson's power seemed invincible, and though they had tried everything, the Philistines could not figure out the source of his divine strength. So, they turned to Delilah. With a mixture of charm, cunning, and calculated intent, they approached her with an offer she could hardly refuse. In exchange for a great sum of silver, Delilah was tasked with discovering the secret of Samson's strength. The mission she accepted was no simple task, yet she knew that the rewards would be more than worth the risk. Delilah, ever the strategist, used all of her skills to get closer to Samson. She weaved a web of allure and manipulation, charming him with her beauty and persuasive words. She was careful, patient, and shrewd, gradually earning Samson's trust while simultaneously working to uncover his most guarded secret. Little by little, Delilah brought Samson closer to revealing the truth, using both tenderness and persuasion, knowing that with each passing moment, her hold over him grew stronger. But what was it about Samson that made him so vulnerable to Delilah's advances? Was it simply his own human weaknesses, or was it something deeper? After all, Samson had been chosen by God, yet he was drawn into Delilah's web despite the warnings that should have been clear. Was he blind to her true motives, or was he deceiving himself into thinking that her love was genuine? As Delilah continued to work her subtle magic on Samson, she knew the power she held was growing, yet she also realized that time was running out. The Philistines were counting on her to succeed, and failure would mean dire consequences. With each attempt to uncover Samson's secret, Delilah inched closer to her goal. But would her victory come at a price that she hadn't yet considered? Would she become so entwined in this mission that it would ultimately destroy both Samson and herself? Overcome by his passion for Delilah, Samson failed to see the manipulation unfolding before him. At first, Delilah didn't directly inquire about the secret of Samson's strength. She began her tactics with subtlety, asking indirect questions, gently probing to uncover what made him invincible. Though Samson was a man of immense physical power, he was not immune to the temptations of human desire, and Delilah understood this weakness all too well. It was when she started to use her feminine charms, her emotions, and her cunning to influence him that the real game began. She approached him with the tenderness of a devoted partner, gradually earning his trust and affection, all the while secretly working against him. Delilah's first attempt was subtle, designed to test the waters. She asked Samson if there was anything that could make him weak, anything that could defeat him. Samson, perhaps not fully realizing the danger he was in, laughed it off and responded with a lie. "If I were tied with 7 fresh bowstrings," he said, "I would become as weak as any other man." Delilah, ever quick to seize an opportunity, did not let this pass by. That very night, while Samson slept, she took 7 fresh bowstrings, tied him up, and called the Philistine leaders to come and capture him. But when they tried to ambush him, Samson's divine strength erupted, and the bowstrings broke as easily as if they were mere threads. The Philistines fled in fear, and Samson, still unaware of the full extent of Delilah's deception, brushed off the situation, assuming she simply hadn't realized her mistake. However, Delilah's persistence was unyielding. She was not easily deterred by one failure. In fact, it only fueled her determination. She knew that the real battle was not about physical strength. It was about emotional manipulation. Samson, ever the passionate man, was becoming increasingly vulnerable to her. Delilah knew that her beauty and charm had worked their magic on him, but it was the psychological pressure she began to apply that slowly wore him down. Each night, Delilah's questions became more insistent, more urgent, and with every passing moment, she tightened her grip on Samson's heart. It wasn't long before Samson, the man who had never shared the secret of his strength with anyone, began to let his guard down. Delilah's emotional manipulation had worn him thin. What had once seemed like love was now entangled with lies and manipulation. Samson began to believe that his trust in Delilah could overcome any danger, and with each night, he found himself inching closer to revealing the secret he had vowed to protect. Finally, exhausted by her relentless probing and worn down by his own vulnerability, Samson gave in. "My strength comes from God," he confessed. "If my hair is cut, my strength will vanish, and I will be like any other man." These words, simple yet profound, marked the point of no return. Delilah, though she feigned surprise and concern, was already planning her next move. As soon as Samson fell into a deep sleep, she summoned a man to cut his hair, cutting off the very symbol of his covenant with God. In that moment, what had once seemed impossible, the loss of Samson's strength, became a reality. With his hair gone, Samson's divine power evaporated, and the hero who had once torn apart lions and defeated entire armies was reduced to a mere mortal. When Samson awoke, he felt no different at first. He had always awakened with a sense of invincibility, but today was different. He sensed something was wrong, though he couldn't quite place it. As he saw the Philistines advancing upon him, he instinctively tried to rise to his feet and fight as he always had. But to his horror, his body did not respond as expected. The strength that had allowed him to tear apart cities, to face thousands of enemies, was gone. He tried to stand, to break free, but he was weak, utterly powerless. The Philistines, seeing him vulnerable, wasted no time. They easily captured him, and without the need for chains, they took him to Gaza, the Philistine city. Samson, once a symbol of strength and divine power, was now a spectacle for his enemies' amusement. They gouged out his eyes, robbing him of his sight and plunging him into eternal darkness. The physical blindness was symbolic, a cruel reminder of how Samson had allowed his desires to cloud his judgment. But the humiliation did not end there. Samson was forced into slave labor, grinding grain at the mill, his once mighty arms now reduced to pushing a heavy stone. The man who had torn down the gates of a city, the man who had faced armies with nothing but divine strength, was now humiliated, powerless, and shackled. Samson's fall was not only physical, but emotional and spiritual. He had been chosen by God for a great purpose, to deliver Israel from the Philistines. But now he was blind, captive, and mocked by those he had once defeated. His life, filled with miraculous strength and divine purpose, had descended into a tragedy of betrayal, manipulation, and the crushing consequences of a single mistake. While in captivity, Samson began to reflect deeply on his life. The once mighty man, now blind and humbled, was forced to face the harsh reality of his downfall. He had spent so much of his life relying on his extraordinary physical strength, believing that it was the source of his power. But now, stripped of that strength and confined to a life of humiliation, Samson realized that his true power had never come from his muscles or his hair. His strength had always come from the presence of God. He had allowed his arrogance and impulsiveness to lead him astray, but even in his failure, he began to understand something profound. God had not abandoned him, nor had he abandoned his people. In the darkness of his imprisonment, Samson found an unexpected opportunity for spiritual renewal. While he had once believed that his strength lay in his physical abilities, he now saw that his true strength was a gift from God, and that gift was not dependent on his hair, but on his faithfulness to God. Despite his brokenness, there was still hope. Over time, as his hair began to grow back, Samson realized that this simple act of regrowth symbolized something much greater, the possibility of restoration. It was a sign that the covenant between him and God could still be renewed. The growth of Samson's hair was not just a physical process, but a spiritual one. It was a sign that God's grace could still reach him, even in the deepest pit of despair. As his hair slowly grew back, so did his understanding of his true mission. Samson began to grasp the full meaning of his life's purpose. His great feats, the tearing apart of lions, the defeat of armies, the destruction of cities, were never truly his accomplishments. They were acts of divine intervention, demonstrations of God's power working through him. He had been chosen not because of his own abilities, but because God had a plan for him. In his blindness and weakness, Samson realized that the key to his true strength had always been his faithfulness to God. Now, at his lowest point, he found himself ready to surrender to God in a way he never had before. The man who had once been full of pride and self-reliance now stood humbled, aware that his strength came not from his own might, but from the Lord. Samson understood that his previous victories had been because of God's power, not his own. And now, with his faith renewed, he was ready to be the man God had always intended him to be. His heart, once driven by his own desires, now sought to fulfill God's purpose for his life. Samson's journey was a powerful reminder that even in our greatest failures, God offers us the chance for redemption. Even in the moments when we feel lost and abandoned, God's love and grace are always available, waiting to restore us. Samson's story, filled with tragedy, triumph, and ultimate restoration, teaches us that no matter how far we fall, we can always rise again through God's strength and mercy. While Samson languished in captivity, humiliated and bound in Gaza, the Philistines reveled in their hard-won victory. They had subdued the mighty hero of Israel, and their celebration knew no bounds. In the grand temple of Dagon, their pagan god, the Philistines threw a massive festival, a public spectacle meant to showcase the downfall of their once feared adversary. The temple was packed with leaders, soldiers, and civilians, all united in joyous mockery. Their laughter filled the air, their toasts and dances resounding in triumph, as Samson's humiliation became the centerpiece of their victory. Shackled and blind, Samson was paraded before them, a living trophy of their conquest. Yet, despite his suffering, there was something about him, a presence that unsettled even his enemies. As he was led into the temple by a young servant, the crowd momentarily fell silent, their respect for him momentarily breaking through their mockery. Samson, though weakened and dishonored, stood in the midst of their celebration, and for a brief moment, even they couldn't deny the strength that still lingered within him. Positioned between the temple's two great pillars, Samson ran his fingers along the cold stone, feeling the imperfections and cracks within the columns. It was then that he remembered who he was and why he had been chosen. No longer did he feel the impulse for revenge or anger. This was a moment beyond personal suffering. It was a moment of divine purpose, one that would fulfill the reason he had been brought into this world. His eyes were closed, but his spirit was wide awake. He understood that this was the final chapter of his life, his chance to fulfill God's mission, even at the cost of his own life. What happened next was one of the most dramatic and profound moments in the Bible. Samson, though physically weak, was filled with a newfound sense of faith and determination. His prayer, unlike any he had spoken before, reflected a heart transformed by repentance. No longer relying on his own strength, he cried out to God, "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more." His words were not the arrogant demands of a man who had relied on his own power, but the humble plea of a man who now understood that his strength could only come from God. In this prayer, Samson acknowledged his mistakes and his dependence on divine grace. It was a plea for one final chance to fulfill God's will. As Samson gripped the pillars, his feet firm against the ground, he felt a surge of strength like never before. It was as if his broken, weak body was being filled with a supernatural force. The energy he thought he had lost was now coursing through him again, but this time it was not his own. It was a divine power. With all the strength he could muster, Samson pushed against the columns. At first, they resisted, but then tiny cracks began to form. The ground beneath him started to tremble, and the mocking laughter of the Philistines faded into stunned silence as they sensed the change. The columns began to give way, and the temple, this monumental structure, shuddered. With one final earth-shaking effort, Samson pushed with all his might. The columns cracked, and the temple, once a symbol of Philistine pride, began to collapse. The ground rumbled, and the air was filled with the deafening sound of destruction as the temple fell, crushing not only the Philistine leaders, but also thousands of soldiers and civilians who had gathered to celebrate. Samson's final act was one of ultimate sacrifice. It was not just an act of vengeance or a bid for glory, but a surrender of his life for the greater good of Israel. In his death, Samson fulfilled the very calling he had been chosen for, to deliver his people from the oppression of the Philistines. His sacrifice, though tragic, was the culmination of God's plan for him. In that moment, his life's purpose was fully realized, not in triumph, but in a sacrificial act of obedience and faith. Samson's final words and his ultimate act of strength remind us that even in our greatest weaknesses, God can use us for his purposes. His life, filled with moments of both divine power and human failure, stands as a testimony to the redemptive power of God's grace. Even when we fall, God can use our final moments to accomplish something greater than we could ever imagine. Samson's sacrifice was not in vain. It was the key to Israel's redemption. And as the dust settled over the ruins of the temple, one could not help but reflect on the profound truth. Sometimes, it is in our deepest moments of loss that we find the strength to fulfill our divine purpose. Samson's sacrifice was more than just an act of defeat. It was an act of redemption. Despite the many failures he had experienced throughout his tumultuous life, his death ultimately brought victory to Israel. By giving his life to bring down the Philistines, Samson fulfilled his final mission, his death transforming into the triumph of his people. His sacrifice became a powerful symbol of God's strength, a strength that transcends human limitations, capable of turning even moments of greatest weakness into extraordinary acts of divine purpose. Though the strongest man in the Bible had fallen, in his final act, Samson rose again in spirit, and his downfall became a victory for his people. After Samson's death, Israel was able to experience a brief respite from the oppression of the Philistines. But the true legacy of Samson was not simply in the battles he fought or the victories he achieved. What endured was the lesson his life imparted, that God's strength is far greater than any human might, and a man's true power does not lie in his physical ability, but in his faithfulness to the divine purpose. Samson's life, full of both monumental triumphs and painful failures, reminds us that true power comes not from self-reliance, but from recognizing the sovereignty of God in our lives. Through both his failures and his triumphs, Samson became a symbol of the fragile nature of human strength. His life demonstrated that even the mightiest man can be susceptible to temptation, and that even in moments of apparent defeat, God's will can still be fulfilled. But his story was not just about his own struggles. It was also about the profound influence of those around him, particularly Delilah. The woman who ultimately betrayed him played a pivotal role in his downfall, and her actions are a reminder of how human weaknesses can be manipulated for destructive purposes. Delilah, with her beauty and cunning, stands out as one of the most controversial figures in the Bible. Though she lacked Samson's physical strength, she possessed a different kind of power, the ability to manipulate his emotional vulnerabilities. Her role in Samson's demise is one of the greatest acts of deception in Scripture, and her betrayal of Israel's hero is often viewed with scorn. Yet, her character is not so easily dismissed. Unlike other enemies Samson faced, Delilah did not present herself as a direct adversary. Instead, she posed as a trusted confidant, a woman eager to please. This deception made her betrayal all the more devastating, as she played on Samson's love for her leading him to believe that she was worthy of his trust. Her motivations are complex, and though the Bible does not offer a clear explanation, it is evident that Delilah's actions were influenced by external pressures. Perhaps it was the promise of wealth and power that enticed her, or maybe it was fear of the consequences she might face if she refused to help the Philistines who surrounded her. Whatever her reasons, Delilah's manipulative nature was clear. She did not care about the destruction her actions would bring upon Samson or his people. She used his affection as a tool to achieve her own goals, ultimately revealing the secret that would lead to his downfall. But Delilah's story is not just one of betrayal. It is a story of temptation. She represents the subtle, insidious forces that lead people astray, not through force or coercion, but through emotional manipulation. She didn't appear as an outright enemy, but as a friend, someone who Samson believed he could trust. This subtle manipulation was the key to her success. Delilah knew Samson trusted her, and she used that trust to bring about his ruin. Yet, in the end, it was this very manipulation that led to her own downfall. She may have been victorious for a time, but in the end, she lost everything that truly mattered: integrity, honor, and the trust of those who once believed in her. Delilah's fate after Samson's death remains unknown, with no further records of her life in the Bible. But her role in Samson's story is undeniable. She became an enduring symbol of how human motivations can be fraught with complexity and ambiguity. Her betrayal, though monumental, was not just a reflection of her malice, but a manifestation of her own vulnerabilities and desires. In this, Delilah's story mirrors Samson's. Both were driven by their own weaknesses, yet both played crucial roles in a greater divine plan. The story of Samson and Delilah ultimately teaches us about the consequences of our choices. Samson's decision to reveal the secret of his strength led not only to his personal downfall, but to the suffering of his people. Likewise, Delilah's choice to betray Samson for personal gain ultimately led her to lose everything of true value there. Stories remind us that even the greatest heroes and the most seemingly innocent individuals are vulnerable to temptation and deceit. The power to make choices, to either surrender to divine will or act out of selfishness, is what shapes our lives and our legacies. And in the end, the story of Samson and Delilah challenges us all. Where does our true strength lie? Is it in our own abilities, our own desires, or is it in trusting in God's plan, even when it leads us down difficult paths? Samson's life was a journey of redemption, reminding us that no matter how far we fall, God can still use us for His greater purpose, if we have the faith to trust in Him, even in our weakest moments. Samson's life, filled with both triumph and tragedy, teaches us profound lessons about the choices we make, their consequences, and the incredible impact they have, not just on our own lives, but on the lives of others. His story is not just about physical might or military victories. It's about redemption, sacrifice, and fulfilling a divine calling. Despite his numerous failures and weaknesses, Samson was chosen by God to deliver Israel from the oppression of the Philistines. His tragic life only magnifies the greatness of his mission, and it is through his ultimate sacrifice that we see the depth of God's plan unfold. Samson's greatest act of strength was not in the numerous battles he fought, or in the physical feats that made him a living legend. His greatest moment of strength came in the very end, in his self-sacrifice. When Samson chose to give his life by bringing down the temple of Dagon, he achieved the ultimate victory, not just for himself, but for his people. It wasn't the strength of his muscles or his hair that made him strong in that moment, but his surrender to God's will. Samson's death was his final submission to the divine purpose for which he had been chosen, and in this tragic end, he fulfilled the role of Israel's deliverer once and for all. The journey leading to this moment was one of immense growth and painful reflection. After his downfall, blinded and bound, Samson realized that the strength he once relied on was not his own. In his darkest hour, he recognized that true strength came from faithfulness to God, not from his physical abilities. His prayer in the temple of Dagon reflected this transformation. Samson's prayer was not a desperate cry for personal glory or victory, but a plea for strength to fulfill his God-given purpose. He asked God to strengthen him just once more, not for revenge, but to accomplish the mission that had always been the true purpose of his life. This was no longer a story about a man with extraordinary physical strength. It was a story about a man who had learned that true power lies in obedience to God. In that moment of surrender, Samson's strength returned, not from his own will, but through God's grace. With his hands pressed against the pillars of the temple, Samson felt the divine power surge through him. As he pushed with all his might, the temple began to tremble, and the columns cracked under the weight of his faith. The moment was charged with divine energy. The ground beneath the Philistines' feet shook as Samson, with one final push, brought the temple crashing down. The very structure that had once held the pride of their victory was now their undoing. It was not Samson's body that defeated the Philistines, but God's power that worked through his obedience and sacrifice. This final act of faith not only destroyed the physical temple of Dagon, but also shattered the power of the Philistines, freeing Israel from their long-standing oppression. Samson's death was a moment of profound sacrifice, but it was not in vain. Though it came in a moment of personal weakness and suffering, it served as a powerful reminder of the potential for redemption. His story teaches us that no matter how far we fall, no matter how deep our failures may be, God can still use us for His greater purpose. Samson's final victory came through his weakness, reminding us that even in the most desperate situations, God can turn our brokenness into something extraordinary. Delilah's betrayal, Samson's weakness, and his final sacrifice all serve as a reminder that our choices matter, especially when we are chosen by God. Samson's life challenges us to reflect on where we find our strength. Are we placing our trust in our own abilities, as Samson did? Or are we relying on God's strength to carry us through our struggles? Samson's story shows us that the true source of power is not in physical strength, but in our willingness to surrender to God's plan. In the end, the story of Samson is one of redemption. Even in his most vulnerable moments, God used Samson to accomplish His will. His legacy is not defined by his mistakes, but by the victory God achieved through his sacrifice. And as we reflect on Samson's journey, we must ask ourselves, what can we learn from his story? How can we surrender our own strength and trust in God's greater purpose for our lives? Share your thoughts in the comments below. What does Samson's story mean to you, and how can we apply his lessons to our own lives? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can continue learning from stories that inspire and transform.